Hello everyone, welcome back. Wisteria here. So, we've just been doing the history of England's witch trials. We did that. And then we went on to England and British witchcraft, which included Scotland, Ireland, Wales, etc. And there is still more of that to come. But there is also something else that I would like to bring, and I'm very excited about this. And this is regarding the one and only Yorkshire Witch. Because I'm from Yorkshire, I think that's why I'm so into it. But it's about Mary Bateman. And Mary Bateman was the Yorkshire Witch. In the view of overly lengthy title of the extraordinary life and character of Mary Bateman, the Yorkshire Witch, traced from the earliest thefts of her infancy through a most awful course of crimes and murders, till her execution at the New Drop near the castle of York on Monday, the 20th of March, 1809. Note the date. Henceforth, were referred to throughout the text the title of The Extraordinary Life of Mary Bateman. That's a writing, something that is in history wrote down to signify the start of who she is, I guess. A knavish and vicious disposition. Mary Bateman was born, and she wasn't really of any importance, little importance actually. The date of her birth went unrecorded. That's how little important she was. When it came to her final moments, however, on the gallows, thousands of spectators witnessed her execution upon York's New Drop on the morning of Monday, the 20th of March, 1809, some of whom, packed shoulder to shoulder in the crowd, were convinced to the very end that the Yorkshire Witch would save herself from death at the last moment by employing her supernatural powers to vanish into the air as a noose tightened. Needless to say, that actually never happened. She was 41 at the time of her execution. Her exact birth date is not known. The parish records, though, of Topcliffe in the North Riding of Yorkshire show her being baptised on the 15th of January 1768. English parish registers are a general rule recorded baptisms rather than births. We can assume if she was born late 1767 or early 1768, as the average age at baptism increased from 1 week old to the middle of the 17th century to 1 month by the middle of the 19th century. The church itself, with its 14th century interior fittings, was extensively rebuilt in 1880s. Born Mary Harker in Assenby, a town in the parish of Topcliffe on the south bank of the River Swale, a few miles south of the larger market town of Thirsk. She was the third of 6 children born to Benjamin Harker and his wife Anne Nee Dunning. Benjamin and Anne had married at Brompton, near Northallerton, on the 10th of July 1754, before moving to Assenby, a little less than 15 miles away, to take up a small-scale farming. Assenby today remains a small village with less than 300 inhabitants, with the majority of the surrounding land still given to farming. However, when the Harkers took up a residence, every cottage and farmstead would have been entirely familiar, and every face known. Any stranger passing through would have caused stir. The odd pedlar or a sailor making his way home from sea, across country exciting comment. The decade of Mary's birth was a momentous one. In London, the new king, George III, came under increasing attack from the satirist John Wilkes. At the same time, that trouble was brewing in the 13 British colonies in America. At home, the economic and social upheaval we now call the Industrial Revolution, was beginning to gain momentum of its own. The Harkers were the last generation to live off the land. The children were city dwellers. The couple's first child was Mary's eldest sister, Jane, who was born at Brompton and baptised there in the parish church of St. Thomas, where her parents had been married. That was on the 7th of August, 1755. The church we see today is much altered from the one they knew. It was still a chapel of ease to All Saints, Northallerton at the time, but was heavily rebuilt in 1867. Her subsequent siblings were all born at Assenby. Anne, named for her mother, was baptised 28th of April, 1765. Then after the birth of Mary came Elizabeth, baptised on the 17th of September, 1770. Benjamin, named for her father, was baptised on the 12th of June, 1773, and the youngest, John, whose birth date was recorded as the 7th of September, 1778, was baptised on the 11th of October that year. Mary's parents were noted and as always having sort of maintained a good character, a good standing, a familial attribute, clearly not passed down to the daughter, as from an early age, Mary was said to display knavish and vicious disposition. At the age of 5, apparently reports state, she stole a pair of Morocco, that's fine leather, shoes, and secreted them for some months in her father's barn. Later, she brought them out and pretended she found them. An inquiry proved that this was only one of the instances of lying which so strongly marked her future life. Whether the accounts of her early nefarious nature are to be believed, or whatever, at this tender age, Mary could be forgiven for merely being a mischievous little girl. She did, in her early years, mix with the gypsies, who habitually descended annually in great numbers. And obviously this was not a good idea. Generally for Topley Fair, the sheep and horse fair that had been held at Topcliffe, that was sort of between the 17th and 19th of July since medieval times. A traditional rendezvous for gypsies and horse dealers as far and wide. The Egyptians, as the Elizabethans called them, a century and a half earlier, were the moon men, a dangerous mob of vagabonds who were by law to be driven out of parishes. They had come to be accepted by Mary's time, but no one quite trusted them. Today the small village of Topcliffe is a quiet place, though still larger and busier than the neighbouring Assenby, and it's hard to imagine that this ancient settlement was once a very important town, staging one of the largest annual fairs in the north of England. The charter which allowed this fair, a weekly market, was granted by Edward III. That was in 1327. Some vestiges of Topcliffe's Market Square can still be seen. Traces of where the stalls would have been, pitched with apparent noticeable narrow cordon of cobbles surrounding the market cross. The sale of livestock was primary then. The first of the 3 successive days of the fair was allotted for a sale of sheep, and the second for horses, and the third day was Lady Fair Day, for which the fair was renowned, when the lads would take their sweethearts around the trinket stalls. A kaleidoscope of sights and sounds. The fair attracted entertainers like rope dancers, tumblers, acrobats, with the addition of food stalls, fortune tellers, freak shows, musicians playing hurdy-gurdies and fiddles. Of course, the ubiquitous pickpockets and prostitutes would have been there as well. Though the Topley fairs ceased, actually in the late 1960s, they must have been similar affairs to the long-standing but still extant Appleby Horse Fair, held in Cumbria each June, attracting 10 to 15,000 gypsies and travellers each year, who regard Appleby Fair as the most important date in their celebration or calendar. It remains one of the largest of their gatherings, as well as being a continuing source of controversy and complaint for the local residents. The past Topley gatherings would have been equally colourful occasions, with the opportunity for Romany families and friends to meet, to buy and sell horses, for the young folk to find themselves husbands and wives. It was also the agreed time for enemies to settle old scores. It was customary, and understood, that every quarrel which had occurred during the year, no matter how trivial, had to be settled with a stand-up fight at Topley Fair. And that's where you get the bare-knuckle fighting from. It's not that they're vicious, it's a tradition, it's how they settle scores, it's just what we're done. The fights were continually in progress. Sometimes they did escalate to a free-for-all, especially down the millbank, as well as bare-knuckle bouts taking place alongside the riverbank. There was even a special arena set aside for the women to fight in, by the river on the Assenby side of the bridge. This long-standing custom, and one that died hard, was doubtless fuelled by bow horses that came into existence on fair days, during which time anyone could sell beer by licence, and where stout liquor was especially brewed for the consumption of customers invited to the house for a drink, marked by green branches displayed above the doors, hence the name. With the increased opportunity for those attending the fair to quench their thirst, along with the damage to crops and broken down fences along Park Road and Sykes Lane, where the travellers set up camp, raced their horses along the road, frightening villagers apparently in Assenby. This was less than savoury environment in which the young and impressionable Mary may have picked up some of her gypsy arts and skills that she was later to utilise in a criminal career. It may have been the early exposure to gypsy fortune telling that formed the bedrock of Mary's criminal career. The gullible flocked to her, as they did to others, to buy potions and love draughts, easily convinced of her supernatural talents and the power of the charms she sold. Other than the annual excitement of Topley Fair, we can assume that Mary's childhood was no different to that of any girl growing up in rural North Yorkshire. Toward the close of the 18th century, running around the countryside with her brothers and sisters, perhaps over the old stone bridge spanning the swaled top cliff, surrounded by farmland as it was. The freedom conferred by fine summer weather, long hours of daylight, would have been precious before the year wore on. Candles were lit, earlier and earlier, along with fires in the hearth. As a little girl, she would doubtless have been taught to clean and sew. Most rural cottages had a spinning wheel, even if the families were not part of the putting-out system of Yorkshire's woollens before the coming of the mills. In her spare time, Mary might have even played on the Maiden's Bower, the site of the supposed Mott and Bailey Castle to the east of the village of Assenby, on top of which are the remains of one of England's mystical and forgotten turf mazes, and one of only 10 rare medieval turf labyrinths in the whole country. The tradition of such turf mazes, convoluted paths cut into an area of short grass, is a very ancient one, and speculation as the purpose of such mazes has thrown up various theories, one of which is that they were used by villagers for entertainment, particularly on high days and holidays like May Day. Mary must have also been aware of the fable associated with the Maiden Bower maze, that on a summer's evening, if you happen upon the centre of the maze and kneel down and put your ear to the ground, you can hear the fairies singing. Fairies aside, in her juvenile years, numerous frauds and falsehoods seem to have been attributed to Mary, the extent of which caused her parents to place her in service with a family in Thirsk at the age of 12, in an attempt to amend their daughter's ways. Thirsk lies in the Vale of Mowbray, and was undergoing extensive changes in Mary's day, with a canal. Never finished, really, adding to the chaos of the town. Domestic service was one of the few employment options open to unmarried girls and young women in the late 18th century, and in the view of her youth, Mary would invariably have been employed as a maid of all work at the very bottom rung of the household ladder. Despite this, we know from her subsequent criminal career, Mary was literate. This was unusual in an agricultural family. Especially for a girl. The prevailing attitude of the time, considered sexist today, was that girls were not worth educating as they would always be subservient to men. Oh, I hate that. It is possible that she was taught at Sunday school, but Robert Rake's drive to improve the religious knowledge of the poor did not take off until 1780, by which time Mary was already in Thrisk. She would have been living in modest quarters and working miserably long hours in return for the customary low wage paid for unskilled housework. Many domestic servants under the age of 16 were unpaid, with bed and board being regarded as adequate recompenses. Even if she did receive a salary, it would not have been no more than £1 a day. My lord, a dollar a day, £1 a day, a peso a day, can you imagine that, guys? What? As the lowest order of servant, her work would have been hard. Most houses had not been washed as much as what they did. When they would go in, they'd be washed from the top to bottom, and this would be twice a week. You wouldn't get the mistress of the house doing that, of course. Just the servants. The staircases and entrances had to be scrubbed daily. Young maids like Mary would have shared the jobs as housemaid, kitchen maid and scullion, and almost continuously supply of water was required to keep the household clean, as well as for ablutions and for the kitchen. There was no flush toilet, and newfangled inventions like pipe water were to preserve the urban rich. So many times a day, she would have to stagger back with buckets filled from the nearest pump. Rising at 5 o'clock every morning, Mary would have cleaned the earth, lit the kitchen fire, prepared utensils to cook, to make breakfast, if the household employed that. Otherwise, this task may have fallen to her too, in a more modest household. Before the family woke, she would have lit the fires in their bedrooms. Afterward, emptied the chamber pots and fetched hot water for washing, while the family breakfasted. Mary would make the beds, put back the shutters, sweep the rooms, clean the grates, take the washstand, water downstairs before clearing the breakfast plates and dishes, scouring the pans with a mixture of sand and soap, and then start the round of laborious, repetitive tasks of scraping the fireplaces and scrubbing, sweeping and dusting. That would sort of continue the pattern of her day. Working hours would have been very long, especially in summer, because of the light. In winter, the day would still be long, but they'd be done by 7 p.m. And then only after the pans had been scrubbed after dinner and the bedrooms repaired, then she'd be able to rest. Clothes often had to be brushed and sponged daily, as the streets were so filthy, and servants would also have been expected to launder, mend and sew. We can assume that Mary was at least a fair seamstress in view of one of her later employments. A servant's duties might also encompass buying milk from the cows led by milkmaids into the town, shopping for provisions, though this might have been proved somewhat of a welcome break from a mistress who expected her servants to work like drones, all the time showing a meek obedience and deference whenever they encountered a member of the family, as well as accepting punishment submissively. Servants were beaten for laziness, untidiness, carelessness, and insolence to their employer, or simply if their master or mistress were in a bad temper, though we don't know into which household Mary was placed. Nearly every household who could afford employed servants would have had them. Their number was the symbol of a social standing, with the aristocracy employing as many as 50, while the middle classes might employ 2 or 4. Those lower down the social scale perhaps employed only 1. Mary may well have been placed in one of the larger houses in the town, some 6 miles from her home, in Aslenby village at Thirsk. Anyway, Thirsk was experiencing growth, as a busy market town at the time, already the focus of trade for the scores of surrounding villages, and with the economy bolstered by the wool and the linen industries, it was building of the turnpike roads that led to the town becoming a staging post on the Royal Mails Edinburgh to London run via York. The mail stopped in Thirsk to change horses every afternoon at 4 o'clock, while the Express, the High Flyer, and other famous coaches kept on equally punctual schedule on the route from London, Edinburgh, Newcastle, Leeds and Darlington, with coaches calling at the Three Turns, adapted for use as a coaching inn around 1740, the Golden Fleece, oh I love that place, one of the oldest coaching inns in England, and the sound of 4 in hands as they galloped into Thirsk marketplace, hoofs and wheels clattering on the cobblestones, must have been familiar to Mary, and she may even have been employed in one of these inns at some point, as her tenures of employment in Thirsk turned out to be various yet brief, with the high turnover rate of those in service existed due to innumerable grievances and disputes between domestics and their masters and mistresses. Usually women could expect to continue working until marriage. Towards the close of the 18th century, this was typically around the age of 24, maybe a little older. However, after several dismissals from households in Thirsk, quitting each situation under suspicious circumstances, perhaps for petty pilfering, Mary moved to York in 1787, the ancient Eboracum of the Romans, where the 4th Legion was based. The city had become an important Viking centre, yes, Jorvik, and was the seat of the second primate of England, the Archbishop of York. It retained much of its medieval past in Mary's time, but was easily the biggest place she would have ever seen in her life up to this point. It was a smart move. Gaining employment in another house in Thirsk would have required a character reference. Unresolved disputes were a serious obstacle to gaining future positions, especially in a town where Mary's dubious employment history must have been known. Whether Mary was dismissed in each instance or left of her own volition, she could have faced months of unemployment and worse still, while those discharged by her employers were owed wages up to the date of dismissal. A servant who quit was owed nothing. Presumably, though, the guile would later become a prominent character trait. Mary secured another position in the service in York. Before the year was out, she was again dismissed for the theft of articles from her mistress. She departed in disgrace, and presumably in a hurry. She left without her clothes or wages. She'd be aged 20, and Mary had sacked from so many positions she had been that no one in the right mind would employ her. Without hope of reference, she shrewdly opted to move to Leeds, where her dubious reputation was unknown. In 1788, Leeds was a large town, already described in 1730 as one of the largest and most flourishing towns in the whole country. With the momentum of the Industrial Revolution, its expansion had continued. Typical of the rapidly growing manufacturing towns that had long been established as markets for the sale of cloth, Leeds had all the characteristics of the burgeoning industrial environment. By 1801, the year of the first census, the population of Leeds had reached 30,000, almost double that of York. This increase was caused by a rise in the birth rate and an influx of people looking for work, a labouring multitude who supplied the new urban mills and factories with cheap labour and worked hard. They drove the success of industrial Leeds, but nevertheless endured poverty, overcrowding, and little, if any, prospect of improving their lot. Where better than for Mary to become lost in the, anonymity of the swelling crowd? Who knows? In time she could exploit the gullible weakness of the poor and desperate, easily deceived into placing their simple trust in the hands of a compulsive liar, a confident trickster, a thief and a fraudster, who through her skill as an accomplished actress could make her victims believe that she had supernatural powers. The fact that she could write must have been immediately impressive to any target or group. Though she remained without employment or friends for a considerable amount of time, Mary decided that joining the swelling ranks of the factory workers was not for her, perhaps because she knew that the conditions in the factories were harsh. The work was very hard, the hours long, up to 72 a week. Accidents were commonplace, exhausted factory hands carrying out repetitive tasks, easily made mistakes. With the absence of any health and safety precautions, there were usually no guards on machinery. The work was also very dangerous. In some mills, especially in the flax mills, which proliferated in Leeds where the flax spun was later woven into linen, the air was full of dust, creating and worsening many health conditions. There was also the risk of fire, the serious blaze which broke out in one of Leeds' flax mills. We'll cover it later as we go along. One young worker, James Carpenter, reported the horrific incident or accident which happened to one of his colleagues at the mill that he worked in. Harriet Wilson worked at Mr. Tennant's. Her arms were taken off by the side gearing of a cord on the opposite side to where the straps run. I saw it done. She was picking the flanks off just a little before 12 o'clock in the day. The wheel caught her sleeve and pulled one arm in. I'm trying to extricate that the other went in. I think what he's saying is he tried to help her get one out, but as we were doing that, the other one went in. Another factor in Mary was seeking employment from her point. It may well have been that of her age. The factory owners preferred to hire children because they were cheaper, obviously, than adults. They were easier to discipline. Children as young as 9 were employed in the mills, though at one Leeds factory, Marshall & Co., other children of 11 or 12 were found as they worked harder and did not have to be supervised. Nevertheless, Mary needed to earn a living. There was another option to her. Many women believed that prostitution was less dangerous than factory work and more bearable than the back-breaking civility of domestic service. Young girls frequently took to the streets without understanding the inherent dangers of their new profession, living a hand-to-mouth existence, pawning their clothes to buy drink. Most prostitutes were addicted to gin within months of starting work. The majority would be beaten by their clients. In this situation, the girls' appeal to law would be pointless, since most men in large cities had contracted venereal disease. Nearly all working girls were infected within a year of walking the streets, and many turned to petty crime, and the ones who stole from their clients may have broke even. If they escaped prosecution, many died within 5 years from disease, assault by a client, or the result of a botched abortion. A circumstance pertinent to Mary Bateman's later career. Yet the path on the streets was one which Mary didn't follow either. Instead, a friend of her mother got her a job in a shop of a mantua market. This was a fashionable lady's overgown of the period, usually worn with a coordinating petticoat, and it was here that Mary rather surprisingly remained for more than 3 years, obviously displaying some aptitude on the seamstress. If she was repeating her behavioural pattern of theft in stealing from the employer, Mary must have been very careful, but she began supplementing her earnings with a profitable sideline as a soothsayer, telling fortunes, making love potions for would-be sweethearts. Mary's reputation as something as a witch was not new. However, another sorceress hailing from Yorkshire, the Knaresborough-based Ursula Southill, better known as Mother Shipton, had been famed for prophesying the future some 3 centuries previously. She exhibited prophetic and psychic abilities from an early age, and with a large crooked nose, bent back and twisted legs. To the superstitious, her appearance was that of the typical witch. Though she was taunted by the local populace, they still bought her remedies and potions made from the flowers and herbs. Her prophecies began with seemingly insignificant premonitions, but as she practiced, her confidence grew. She became known as Nasbara Prophetess, earning her a living in foretelling the future held. And when she spoke, people just believed her. They passed her words on, and her power to see into the future made her well known, not only in the hometown, but throughout the whole country. Mother Shipton lived in Tudor England, but she predicted the fates of several monarchs in the future, not to mention the Great Fire of London in 1666. The building of Crystal Palace, she also said that would happen in 1851, and the outbreak of the Crimean War in 1854. She said they would all happen, and they did. While the infamous witch hunts that had reached the peak in Britain in the 17th century had long since abated, the last witch to be executed in England was that of Alice Molland, who was sent to the gallows in Exeter in 1684. Now, we've already spoke about Alice, and though she is registered as being one of the last, if you remember, in the trial at Exeter, we don't actually now. We're not sure if that was the case at all, so don't take that to fact, because there's other statements that don't coincide with it, so we're not sure. The decline in trials and hunts, the result of the Church's condemnation of witches as devil-worshipping heretics, did not necessarily mean the decline is long-held belief in witches, and unfounded fears and irrational still abounded, even in the age of reason, which saw the arrival of the steam engine and a certain intellectual opposition to superstition. Among the poor there was still the dread of the unknown. Trust in magic or chance was commonplace, and Mary Bateman was well placed to exploit the fear in the susceptible souls amongst the poor and dispossessed, now inhabiting the rapidly growing town of Leeds. For these people, living conditions were grim, wages were low, men rarely earned more than 12 shillings a week, women only 2 or 3 shillings. Children got half of that, again in many cases. Their addition to the family income was vital. From these meagre earnings, as well as food, there were basics like candles, salt, fuel, clothes, linen, that had to be paid for. And then there was the rent. Families were crammed into first developments of blind back houses, wherever they are, the precursors of back-to-back housing, built around yards and courts behind the main streets of the town. As their fronts faced each other across a small courtyard, and adjacent properties were similarly developed, the blind back houses became back-to-backs, scantily furnished with few possessions. Except for some basic furniture and cooking utensils, the space would have been cramped in the face of economic necessity and the absence of any effective birth control. Many were close to destitution, in the climate of overcrowding and deprivation, living in filthy conditions where dysentery outbreaks were frequent. Mary played on the superstition of the first and the second generation of mill workers. She used the old wives' tale that it was risking lifelong spinsterhood to sit on the table, that to do certain things and things happen. That's what wives' tales are. And basically, they tell a story, actually. If you sit down and read them properly, they actually do tell a story. But you don't get many seen like that now. You know, they're usually just little wordings. To rock an empty cradle would encourage the birth of another child. She almost certainly began to add abortion to her repertoire. 2 other witches were operating in Yorkshire at the time. One was Old Nan, the locally renowned cunning woman who lived beneath the overhang of Kilnsey Crag in Wharfdale in the late 1700s. Old Nan, or Nancy Winter, to give a real name, was famous throughout the Craven district for telling people's fortunes, and even had a witchcraft shop in Baggs Alley in Skipton. How effective her predictions were remains questionable in the view of the fact that her stock of spells was not very large. Old Nan relied on her pet guinea pig and half a pack of dirty playing cards in her divination methods. The other was Anna Green, or Ling Bob Witch, as she was commonly known, a renowned fortune teller who lived in the outskirts of Bradford in the latter half of the 18th century. She must have been very successful at the time, though, because when she died in 1810 she saved more than £1,000, and that was a fortune at that time. Her chosen method of divination was the reading of tea leaves, a popular method of fortune-telling which began to increase the popularity during the 17th century, when tea was introduced into Europe from China, although she could occasionally be induced to make some more general prophecies. The services of the Ling Bob Witch came to be held in such high esteem that the rich, the aristocratic, would travel considerable miles and distances just to sit with her and have a consultation. Their carriages were teams of horses and attendant grooms. They were not an uncommon sight, and they were often seen lined up outside her home. And these were pretty prestigious people. This was a cottage on the edge of the moor, on the left of the old road from Otley to Bradford, between Carlton and Yeadon, the tall chimney stack painted white, so her gentrified clients would know where to find her. Clearly old Nan and Ling Bob Witch, whose career spanned 40 years, were rather more benign practitioners than Mary Bateman. No whiff of any criminal association ever attached itself to either of them. It was said after nightfall Hannah Green could transform herself into any form, but both she and Nancy Winter were free of the accusations of frauds, petty thefts, poisonings and murder that were to cling to Mary. Interestingly, the village of Mary's birth also spawned another who looked upon by some as a witch. This was a woman called Peggy Lumley, who lived in Asenby in the mid-1800s. A description of Peggy can be found, and apparently it was given by a T. Carter Mitchell, and he was a Thrisk Falcon that was 1887. Now I don't know who that is, but he seems like he wrote for magazines that were Masonic in nature, so they'd have been for like the Templars and such, I suppose. And it was noted that he did have quite a local personality of himself, which means he had quite the personality, you know. He donned a frock coat, a top hat, and the first evening of Topley Fair, he'd make his way down the hill, cover the bridge to the gypsy encampment, where he visited each caravan, welcomed the occupants, and he portrayed Peggy Lumley like this: a great reader, especially of quaint old books which taught of necromancy and magic art. A clever, strong-minded woman, she mingled her conversations with dark sayings too deep for the comprehension of her own associates. Her appearance, too, was striking. A tall, commanding figure. She reminded me of the enchantress Medea. I love Medea. She's awesome. She can be very evil, but she's awesome. But for a fearsome squint in her eyes, although it distracted from her comeliness, because, well, a votary of the black art. There were even stories circulating of persons who, having unwittingly angered Peggy, received from her a look which made them return home, forbidding to find some of their stock stone dead. That's called the evil eye. You see, they make out this evil eye, right, is a picture of an eye. It's not, okay? I need to explain this. The picture of the eye repels the evil eye. The evil eye itself comes from how a witch looks at you I know this because many a times I have been told, stop looking at me with the evil eye. That's what your dad used to do, Claire. And from growing up in that sort of family, I can honestly say to you, it's the evil eye of a witch looking at you. And you'll know, you will know when a witch looks at you with the evil, you'll just know. I can't explain it any other way. Peggy Lumley was a force to be reckoned with, and she should certainly not be crossed. Perhaps it was something in Assenby's water. Late 1792, Mary was still working in the shop of the mount maker. The soothsaying side line had expanded, and as many folk believed her to possess supernatural powers of divination and fortune-telling, the smooth-tongued deceiver gained something of a reputation among the superstitious of Leeds. In addition to telling fortunes, she specialised in removal of evil witches, but unlike Ling Bob Witcher's affluent customer base, drew her clientele larger from the ranks of servant girls who occasionally introduced their mistresses to Mary's services. By the age of 24, Mary seems to have also cast another kind of spell with a view to her longer-term prospects, bewitching a potential source of livelihood and security in the shape of one John Bateman. Bateman was a wheelwright, the son of another John Bateman, who was the town crier of Thirsk. Astonishingly, after a whirlwind courtship of only 3 weeks, the couple were married, by licence, at St. Peter's Church in Leeds, on the 26th of February, 1793. But marriage did nothing to change Mary Harker's old ways. Within 2 months of the newlyweds moving into furnished lodgings in High Court Lane, close to the river wharves where the west of the parish church were, and where they'd been married actually, Mary had already stolen from another lodger on the premises. Breaking open a man's box of belongings, she stole his watch, some silver spoons, and 2 guineas. In this instance, Mary escaped prosecution and the full weight of the law by returning the stolen goods and cash. There can be little doubt the extraordinary life acerbically recorded that the young man who was robbed made infamy the price of his clemency. Returning the stolen goods was a tactic that Mary would later repeatedly employ to escape prosecution. When the Batemans later took in lodgers of their own, Mr. Dixon found he was frequently missed small sums of money kept in his room. In total, 2 guineas was found to have disappeared. The finger of suspicion firmly pointed to Mary, despite calling of innocence. Mr. Dixon's threats of prosecution induced Mary to hush up the disgraceful business by returning his money. This was a clever move on Mary's part, as at the time the statute books legislated that the theft of more than 40 shillings from a dwelling place, 21 shillings making up a guinea, was a capital offence. Incidentally, pickpocketing was quite as bad if you robbed more than a shilling on the street. The theft of 5 shillings from a shop also carried the same penalty. This heavy-handed overuse of punishment did not end until the reform of the Penal Code by Robert Peel, Home Secretary, in the 1820s. Though Mary did manage to escape implications of her discovered thefts, it seems she turned to less direct methods of appropriation in fraudulently obtaining retail goods, which could then presumably be sold on. In the 18th century, it was common for shopkeepers to allow customers to buy items on credit, or like an account, with no money exchanged up front. Posing as a buyer for Miss Stephenson, Mary went shopping. Calling at linen draper's shop in Leeds, she asked for fabrics to make up into 3 silk petticoats in the fictitious customer's name, to be sent for Miss Stephenson's inspection. Upon Miss Stephenson's selection, 2 other petticoats would be returned to the shop, the third kept and paid for. Indeed, 2 articles were returned. Mary kept the third, directing that it should be charged to Miss Stephenson's account. Of course, it was never paid for, and out of it she did get herself, a free pocket-drapered petticoat, which would have been a fair decent one at this time as well. Mary was further successful in getting her hands on a gown piece, 2 webs of cloth, as well as some flannel fabric, but this time using Mrs. Smith to dupe another unsuspecting shopkeeper. In a testament to Mary's skill as an actress, that in spite of several charges of swindling that were levelled against her, the shopkeepers involved were persuaded into a mistaken clemency and forgave her. Hindsight, had they not been so kind, the lives of many unfortunate people might have escaped ruin. Mary's darkening reputation meant a frequent change of address was a shrewd and a necessary move. A little over a year after their marriage, the Batemans moved from High Court Lane and took a house in the yard of Mr. Wells, a spirit merchant who lived in Brigate. And then and now, at the heart of Leeds shopping centre, and about a third of a mile from where Batemans had previously lived, safe enough removed from their previous lodgings. While the accommodation in High Court Lane had been furnished, the couple apparently furnished their new abode in Wells Yard themselves in a tolerable, comfortable manner, possibly financed by Mary's various thefts and scams, many of which must have gone unnoticed or unrecorded. In these first years of industrialisation, the flotsam of mill workers drifted constantly, and no one of Mary's class could afford their own homes, so they rented, often from unscrupulous landlords out to rook them. Unable to afford rent, tenants sublet, and the subtenants did likewise, so that tenements filled up with, anonymous people who came and went on a regular basis, and it was crowded too. Whether John Bateman was unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the truth, he cannot have failed to notice a pattern of accusations of theft that appeared to dog his wife. But what Mary did next must surely have sharpened any suspicions. John Bateman harboured about the audacity and wickedness of the character of the woman that he had indeed just married. And I'm going to leave it here for now, guys. That's part 1 of Mary Bateman, the one and only Yorkshire Witch, who was executed at York in the later centuries as well. Remember, this was in the late 18th century. Very unusual, especially regarding the whole case, actually. But we'll get there. Thank you for listening, and many blessings.